Billy Graham wrote, God created man and woman. He put them in a beautiful paradise. Our sin is the cause of much of the suffering in the world. Think of it. Our greed, our selfishness, our pride, our lust. These and other sins are direct causes of suffering. Totally agree with him. The physical world also has been affected by sin and the resulting judgment, so that we see that suffering from natural disasters is another result of sin. I totally agree with him. The Bible says that God made a perfect world. It was very good at the beginning. Man sinned, and that brought in Genesis 3 the judgment of God on the whole creation. God cursed the ground. He cursed the animals. Thorns and thistles began to grow. Romans 8 says the whole creation is in bondage to corruption, in slavery. That's exactly right thinking. But a few years ago, he answered a question in a normal weekly syndicated news article. Somebody wrote in and asked him a question about whether dinosaurs were on Noah's Ark, and he replied, but no, Noah's Ark apparently did not include dinosaurs. The reason is because dinosaurs and similar ancient creatures that we only know from the fossils were extinct by the time God created the human race. So he doesn't even realize that he's believing two contradictory things at the same time. You can't believe in the millions of years and death and bloodshed and the extinction of the dinosaurs before man, and at the same time believe that all the natural disasters in the world are the result of sin. Can't believe both those things. But because people aren't thinking the issue through, that's what's happening. So let me illustrate what's been going on here for 200 years. Back at the time of the Great Evangelical Awakening under Wesley and Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, the church was really healthy. The gospel was being proclaimed. And about 200 years ago, there was a missile that was launched against the gospel. It's the missile of millions of years. And it wasn't aimed at the cross, it was aimed at the foundation of the cross, at the book of Genesis. Consciously, by Charles Lyell and others. They were consciously attacking the book of Genesis. And most of the church said, it doesn't matter, it didn't hit the cross. It doesn't matter what the age of the earth is. Now, if the enemies of the cross had aimed at the cross itself, the church would have had alarm bells go off, and they would have had men defending the gospel of the cross. But the enemies of the gospel were smart. They aimed at the foundation of the cross, and the church said, it's a side issue. It doesn't matter. But Psalm 11:3 says, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The foundations of the cross do matter. And the gospel is rooted in the book of Genesis. The very first prophecy is in Genesis 3:15 of the coming Messiah. The whole reason for the cross is Genesis 3, the fall. Well, over the next 150 to 200 years, the missiles have continued to hammer the church. Once the church compromised on the flood and the age of the earth, then came along Darwin's book, and much of the church compromised and said, well, Darwinian evolution is how God created living creatures. And then once the church accepted that idea, they were pretty adamant for a couple of decades after Darwin published his theory that man was specially created by God. But by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, much of the church was saying, no, even the body of Adam was evolved from ape-like creatures. And so the enemies of the gospel understand that it's a direct hit. But most of the church says around the world, yeah, but it didn't hit the cross, it doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about the Old Testament, just believe the gospel. We're New Testament Christians, so don't worry about it. But what we've seen over the last 200 years has been a growing unbelief in the Western world that was once dominated by Christianity. And what we need to understand, and what most people in the church don't understand, is that the history of the Bible is foundational to the theology and the morality. And if the history of the Bible is not true, then it's only a matter of time before people will begin to question or reject the theology and the morality of the Bible. And that's exactly that's exactly what has happened. Well, in the late 1940s, there was a man named Charles Templeton. He was an evangelist. He was a friend of Billy Graham's. Many considered him even more effective evangelist than Billy. He preached to thousands in the U.S. and in Great Britain through Youth for Christ crusades. But he struggled with evolution. He didn't know what to do with it. And so he went to Princeton Seminary in the late 1940s hoping to get answers. By that time, Princeton was thoroughly liberal theologically. He didn't get any answers. He got professors telling him there was no problem with accepting evolution. He graduated. He preached for a couple more years, but his faith was so shattered by that educational experience that he finally quit the ministry and went into journalism. He died in 2001, but 6 years before his death, he wrote a book, Farewell to God, My Reason for Rejecting the Christian Faith. And this is what he said at the end of the book. I believe that there is no supreme being with human attributes, no God in the biblical sense, but that life is the result of timeless evolutionary forces having reached its present transient state over millions of years. There are consequences to what we believe about Genesis. Now, has everyone who accepted millions of years rejected the faith like Templeton? No, obviously not. But that is a consequence, and that has happened to many, many people. And it certainly has undermined the authority of the Bible in its morality and its teachings on the gospel. So, the battle is just continuing. And we're bombarded with these ideas all the time in the media, in the schools, in the museums, in the science programs on television, and that's why Answers in Genesis and other creation ministries like Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship exist, to try to help the church rebuild the foundations. And we've got to help the children and our grandchildren get resources to be able to understand how to deal with this onslaught. And we've got a website, and there's things you can get on the website of this organization to help deal with these issues. And that's why we do seminars in churches to help equip people, so that then the church can say, come to Jesus, come to the cross and be saved, because this book is true right from the very first verse. The whole thing is true. It's completely reliable. It's completely authoritative. And so we need to have answers. Peter said, but sanctify Christ as Lord in our hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence.